Good afternoon. We come to you live from the University of Visual and Performing Arts, Colombo, Sri Lanka, for discussion with Ambassador Power. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, in a brief visit to Sri Lanka, where she had discussions with political leaders, government officials, civil society officials, and with her visit to the north in Jaffna yesterday, where she was discussing the bilateral trading and to strengthen them, and also after a 30-year devastating civil war, for lasting peace here in Sri Lanka. And today, gathered here for the discussion with the university students and the youth to discuss their needs to bring a betterment to Sri Lanka. And to take proceedings further on, let me call upon the Risha Bastians for the discussion with Ambassador Power. Good afternoon. We come to you live from the University of Visual and Performing Arts, Colombo, Sri Lanka, for discussion with Ambassador Power. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, in a brief visit to Sri Lanka, where she had discussions with political leaders, government officials, civil society officials, and with her visit to the north in Jaffna yesterday, where she was discussing the bilateral trading and to strengthen them, and also after a 30-year devastating civil war, for lasting peace here in Sri Lanka. And today, gathered here for the discussion with the university students and the youth to discuss their needs to bring a betterment to Sri Lanka. And to take proceedings further on, let me call upon the Risha Bastians for the discussion with Ambassador Power.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here today at the JDA Gallery for this discussion. We want to give a very warm welcome to all the young people in the audience here today. Sri Lanka's future is for you to craft, and we hope you find this interaction today helpful as you make decisions going forward about what type of country you want to live in. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Ambassador Samantha Power, the United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations and a member of President Obama's cabinet. Interestingly, she is also the youngest UN ambassador in American history. Before serving as US Permanent Representative to the UN, Ambassador Power served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights on the National Security Staff at the Obama White House. In that role, she focused on issues including UN reform, LGBT and women's rights, the promotion of religious freedom and the protection of religious minorities, human trafficking, democracy, and human rights. But she is also a lot of other things. Ambassador Power was a professor at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and she is also a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Personally, Ambassador Power has been an inspiration because she started her career as a journalist and a war correspondent. If she seems zealous in her commitment to the prevention of atrocities, it is because she was an eyewitness to it in the Bosnian War as a young reporter. Ambassador Power authored an account of the Bosnian Wars that criticized US inaction during the Srebrenica massacre of 1995 in the book titled A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, which earned her the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. As a journalist, she has also reported from global hotspots, including East Timor, Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, and Zimbabwe, and contributed to several leading US publications. So, like many of us in the room today, Ambassador Power has experienced firsthand the kind of violence and conflict that can tear nations apart and people apart and make the world unsafe for everyone. Shaped by these experiences throughout her career, she has worked tirelessly to promote the belief that nations have a moral obligation to prevent human rights abuses and mass atrocities. She is a compelling speaker who cares deeply about some of the world's greatest problems of our time. And I'm sure you'll enjoy this discussion with her today. Please welcome Ambassador Samantha Power.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Darisha. And let me say, there is a mutual admiration society that we can create. Because as all of you know, Darisha is a very distinguished journalist. And what's most impressive about her work is the risks that she takes to report the stories that many others have shied away from, like her coverage on corruption, the erosion of judicial independence, and last year's communal riots in Aluthgama. So thank you, Darisha, for moderating today's town hall, and more importantly, for the essential service that you are providing to your fellow Sri Lankans. I can't tell you all how great it is to be back in Sri Lanka. I have squeezed a lot into the 3 days I get to spend in your amazing country, meeting with political leaders and military officials, civil society groups, human rights defenders, brave journalists like Darisha, and of course, as some of you may have seen, playing LA for the very first time with some schoolgirls at Osmania College in Jaffna. Now, what you may not know, and what was omitted from my otherwise extensive bio, was that long before I wanted to be a journalist or a diplomat, I dreamed of becoming a professional baseball player. And after my first at-bat yesterday at LA, I think my fortune could have turned out differently had I chosen a different sport. It was so wonderful to be with those girls, and I think the greatest part about the photographs that somehow have made it into the Sri Lankan press, it appears, was the faces of those girls as they were zapping the ball at me and getting me out. A lot has changed since I was last in your country, which was in 2010. Twice this year, the majority of people from Sri Lanka have made clear their desire to have a more democratic, inclusive, and accountable government. Twice, you all have chosen the path of reconciliation over that of division. That process of reconciliation, while not complete, is underway. And today I want to talk to you about 3 things that you, the young people of Sri Lanka, can do to help shape that process, both in healing the wounds of the past and building the fundamental freedoms and the inclusiveness that are critical to this country's future, to all of our futures. First, I want to encourage you to continue to exercise your right to shape your country's future. It was the Sri Lankan people, including many young Sri Lankans like you, who chose a government that ran on a platform of greater, stronger democracy, a platform of inclusivity, a platform of respect for human rights. You collectively chose the path of reconciliation over division, hope over fear. But engagement by Sri Lankans cannot end at the ballot box. You must continue to make your voices heard and to hold your government now to the commitments that they have made, because ultimately you are the ones who have the most at stake in Sri Lanka's future. And here I will quote my great president, President Barack Obama, who himself quotes a very famous American Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, when he says, "The most important office in any democracy is the office of citizen." And that's what I think you're going to find in this country, and most of you have already. Consider, as part of this, the participation of young women. I'd guess at least half of you here today are women, and it's inspiring to see so many in the audience. While in many parts of the world, girls still lag behind boys in secondary education, in Sri Lanka, girls actually outnumber boys. In universities, girls make up 60% of undergraduates. And yet, can you all guess or do you know, what proportion of members of Sri Lanka's parliament are women? Any guesses? It's the guy in the front row who knows that. 5%. When Sri Lanka's first parliament was elected in 1947, 3% of the members were women. That was 1947. It's 2015. It's gone from 3% to 5%. That's not much of an improvement. To be fair, most of the world is not where it needs to be either. In the United States, to give you one example, only 20% of our members of Congress are women. And at the United Nations, where I serve as the United States' permanent representative, only 37 countries of 193 are represented by women, which interestingly is roughly the same percentage of women in the US Congress, around 20%. Your country, though, has such a proud tradition of women's leadership, which ought to be translated into women's representation. In 1960, as you know well, yours was the first nation in the world to elect a woman head of state, something I would note that the United States has not yet done, although watch this space. Decades earlier, Sri Lanka was the first country in Asia in which women earned the right to vote. In 1928, when the struggle for women's suffrage here was being hotly contested, one of its leaders, a woman named Agnes de Silva, was asked during an official hearing whether Tamil women laborers on estates should also be included if women were given the right to vote. De Silva's answer, which she later wrote about, was just right. Quote, "I replied that certainly Tamil women laborers are women too. We want all women to have the vote," end quote. Having women in leadership positions is not only intrinsically valuable, it is critically important to the future of your country. Study after study has demonstrated that countries where women are more educated, healthy, and able to fully participate in society, those countries are more stable, more peaceful, and more prosperous. Knowing this and looking out at all of the women in this room, it is baffling to think that only around 550 women competed for seats in the August parliamentary elections, compared to approximately 5,600 men. That is more than 10 male candidates for every woman. So to the women in the room, I say this: surely your communities and your nation would be better served if there were more of you in public office. So I hope a handful of you will consider making a run at office one day soon. Of course, there are many ways to help shape your society, for young women and for young men. I've learned this in my own path, starting, as Darisha said, as a journalist, then becoming an academic and an activist, before making my way somewhat clumsily, initially, into politics, and finally now in my current dream job as a diplomat representing the United States. Of course, there's still another stage in my career. It is, I think, still possible for me to become a professional LA player. Yesterday in Jaffna, I had the privilege of meeting with women in some of the most heart-rending situations imaginable. Women who, against all odds, continue to lead their families and their communities. Women whose husbands or children were killed or disappeared, but who will not give up the search for them. Women whose families were displaced, but who continue to struggle to get their land back, all the while caring for small children. Women who have been the victims of sexual violence, but who have actually been brave enough to demand justice in spite of threats for the perpetrators and stigma from their communities. There are an estimated 60,000 households headed by women like these in the northern province alone, 60,000. And many more women in other parts of the country facing difficult circumstances. An entire generation depends on these women continuing to carry a tremendous burden, often by themselves, and they deserve more support. These women are a prime example of my second recommendation, which is not to allow fear to guide your actions. One of the UN's great diplomats, a man named Sergio Vieira de Mello, who dedicated his career to helping societies like yours emerge from devastating civil wars, and whose life was ultimately cut short in 2003 by a suicide bomber in Iraq. Sergio used to have a saying about this idea. He used to say, "Fear is a bad advisor. Fear is a bad advisor." As you all know so well, this is such an incredibly promising time for your country and for your generation in particular. For the vast majority of young people in this room, your country was at war for most of your lives. And yet, in recent years, you have seen, and in many cases been a part of, the process of transitioning from a country at war to a country at peace. And especially in the time since the January elections, you have seen that process accelerate. From the reforms proposed last week to roll back the powers of the executive, to the restoration of fundamental freedoms that had previously been restricted, to the additional returns of appropriated lands, change is unmistakably underway. But as you know far better than I do, there are some voices, sometimes even voices, maybe even in your own heads, that appeal to your fears. The fear that if you dig too deep into a painful past, you won't be able to pursue a bright future. The fear that restoring certain liberties will come at the expense of your security, which was so long in coming. The fear that if you make real concessions in the pursuit of compromise, your good faith will be turned against you. After nearly 3 decades of conflict, this is perfectly understandable. It's even reasonable. And such fears are not easily unlearned. They linger and they stay in the bloodstream, maybe even in the DNA. But we cannot allow ourselves to be governed by fear. And we cannot allow the fear that we have to prevent us from breaking out of a cycle of mistrust and strife. I want to stress it is not only Sri Lanka that is susceptible to such fears. Look at my country. Look at the ways in which, in recent days, extremely destructive invocation of fear has begun to dominate in our political discourse. In the wake of the Paris attacks, many officials, public servants, have appealed to our people's fears of refugees, saying that we should turn away people who have suffered bombings, people who've suffered disappearances, people who've suffered religious persecution. We should turn them away. Now, these are all experiences that Sri Lankans can relate to. Some people in America have even suggested that we apply a religious test to those seeking refuge in our country, or that we place entire populations under surveillance simply based on their religion. This is outrageous. It is offensive, and it smears the legacy that the United States has, the proud and long-held tradition of taking in people who have endured profound suffering. But leaders, communities, individuals can choose not to be governed by such fears. And this is my third and final point. We've got to be brave enough to get to know the people we fear. Because when we do, we find out they're not so different from us. As some of you may have seen, President Obama was in Malaysia this week for the ASEAN summit. On Friday, he visited a foundation that helps refugee children. He met with a group of kids who will soon be granted asylum by the United States. One was a 16-year-old Rohingya girl who told the president how she had fled her home in Burma at the age of 8 and then been subjected to human trafficking. Having been rescued herself, she now wants to help other kids in situations like hers. Sitting next to her, President Obama said, "Anybody who has a chance to see these kids, hopefully you understand the degree to which they're just like our kids, and they deserve love and protection and stability and an education." And then the president gave this girl a hug. And I now call that the hug heard around the world. It was a beautiful hug. When people speak about the future of Sri Lanka, they often speak about the importance of sending a message of inclusiveness from the top down and making sure that all communities feel as though their voices are being heard. It is true that governments have a crucial role to play in making our societies more inclusive. But the truth is that real inclusiveness, in fact, has to be built from the bottom up by people like you. And it is built, as the President's hug demonstrated, through acts of empathy, through seeing that other people are just like us, that their kids are just like our kids. Let me give just one example. In 2012, the renowned Sri Lankan writer Shyam Selvadurai and an NGO called the National Peace Council launched a project to bring together aspiring young Sri Lankan novelists and poets to write about some of the most difficult times related to the country's conflict. The participants were drawn from different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and the idea, in the words of Selvadurai, was that good writing creates empathy and an opportunity to build bridges between various communities. It was called Write to Reconcile. Write, W-R-I-T-E, to reconcile, as many of you know. One of the 23 participants was a young woman from Jaffna named Sambhavi Sivaji. During the hardest parts of the war, her school was not even allowed to bring in textbooks, forcing her teacher to travel all the way to Colombo to photocopy one, which the 40 kids in her class then shared. Military roadblocks on the road she took to and from school every day made an otherwise short bus ride into a harrowing 2-hour journey. But for Sambhavi, the most impactful part of the program was not the stories she learned to tell, but the ones that she heard. Stories of young people from other backgrounds whose experiences she otherwise would never have known, but who had endured hardships and suffering of their own. Young people who had been forced from their homes or lost parents or been victims of abuse. It was a broadening of perspective that Sambhavi said permanently changed the way she looked at her country. Now she is a second-year student at Colombo University, and she's here with us today. Where are you? Sambhavi, why don't you stand up, please, just for a second? And we're going to give you Now I'd like to ask all the participants from Write to Reconcile who are here with us also to stand up, and let's have all of you get a nice round of applause. So the Write to Reconcile group that is here, don't we have others? Is everybody being shy? Yes, they're being shy. That's what I thought. Wonderful. Thank you so much. The scale of the Write to Reconcile project may seem relatively small, but the impact has been big. In part, that is because the stories that Sambhavi and her peers wrote were eventually compiled into a book, which has since been shared with schools across Sri Lanka. And the lesson of the project is a crucial one. When we make efforts to know and listen to one another, we will be less likely to succumb to those fears. We will know that those other people are not different from us, or at least not that different. We will treat them as we ourselves would hope to be treated, with dignity. You find the golden rule in every religion, including all of the religions practiced here in this great country. In Buddhism, the golden rule goes, hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. In Hinduism, do not unto others what you would not have them do unto you. In Islam, no one of you is a believer until he desires for his brother that which he desires for himself. And the basic empathy that these religions and others preach is something that you all can help build in your classrooms and workplaces, in your neighborhoods and places of worship, with your parents and your children. It is the thread that will tie your communities together and hold those communities together when others try, as some surely will, to break them up, when others try to appeal to your fear or your mistrust. Let me conclude so we can have a discussion and open up to questions. As you all know, a few weeks ago, Sri Lanka lost one of its great leaders, Sobitha Thero. He was a moral compass for the nation on so many issues. the need to curb executive power, the sacredness of protecting freedom of expression. But he was most eloquent and passionate on the need to reconcile Sri Lanka's communities. Sri Lanka is a small island in which live the Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, Malays, and Burghers, he said. We all must think how to live together and not how to live divided. Each time we were divided, the result was defeat. In the 30-year war, no one was victorious. We were all losers, he said. Watching the news lately, it looks as though there are more and more places being torn apart around the world by the divisiveness that Sobitha Thero described. Just consider the last few weeks alone. Ankara, Sinai, Beirut, Paris, Bamako. It can start to feel bleak. And that is why what you are doing here in Sri Lanka is so important. For your own people, of course, but also for people far away from this island. People around the world are watching Sri Lanka. We are talking about the process that you all are engaged in here. We are completely behind your efforts. And this is true especially in the United States. President Obama asking every day, how's it going in Sri Lanka? How are they doing? What's going on with that Prevention of Terrorism Act? What's going on with that land reclamation? What's going on reconciliation? People are asking these questions. They want to know what's going on. How are the young people doing? How's the job situation? What's happening in Sri Lanka? People want to know, and we want to be by your side as you undertake what I know feel some days like monumental challenges. And I know that at times it can feel as though the change is not coming fast enough. And to real reformers, it always seems like change is too slow. But you must not let that impatience shake your commitment to making your voices heard, or let it prevent you from listening to the voices of others. When you are feeling the most impatient, that's actually the moment to get more involved and not less. It is what will help you demand and ultimately succeed in attaining the change that you and your country so need. So stay engaged. Don't let fear be your bad advisor, and let empathy help you see the dignity of others. Follow that, and there is no limit to what you and your country can achieve. Thank you very much. Question time. Here, please. Why don't we can sit in on that. Just mood strike. Yes, absolutely.
Welcome back, Ambassador Power. I just want to take us back to the UN resolution that the US government and Sri Lankan
Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
A question on the resolution actually at the UN Human Rights Council, which was co-sponsored by the government of Sri Lanka and the US government. There's specific benchmarks and issues that have been identified. Just your thoughts on the next phase. You talked about change and reform. What is the next phase that you see Sri Lanka going through in terms of the resolution? But also, what is the support you see the US government providing Sri Lanka in terms of us achieving what's in there, but also in terms of technical support to get us to that?
First, let me say that it was an amazing experience, I think, for so many who had worked so long in this country to try to promote the idea of justice and accountability, to see Sri Lanka not only support the resolution at the Human Rights Council in September, but co-sponsor it. And this was after the previous government had opposed, I think, 3 previous resolutions and lobbied furiously against those resolutions, which were really quite modest. In fact, just urging there be even domestic processes to hold accountable the perpetrators of grave crimes. So I think in terms of the next steps, which are the ones that you and others here have helped ensure, got written into the resolution in the first place, the consultative process is extremely important. And having been in the North yesterday, and I know, no matter where you go in the country, you'd have some different account of how the war had affected different families. And so everyone in this country should have a voice and somehow find a way to express how they think these processes should take hold. So that consultation is extremely important. A lot of the communities that were the most affected by war and the most affected by terrorism have felt voiceless and have not felt as if their dignity was respected, whether throughout the war or in the years since, as they go around and with a photo of a missing family member and can't get anybody to return their phone calls. And so this consultative process, to make it as broad and as deep, but also there is a desire to move forward, and so one wants to get these institutions in place relatively quickly. But that consultation seems very, very important. It's critical that there be buy-in from the communities most affected by the conflict. And that will also, of course, that will be in part because of consultation and because of buy-in, hopefully on the front end, but also the quality of the institutions that are created. And I will say, just in my couple days here, that I'm impressed by the extent to which civil society is itself part of what still is kind of a brainstorming process about what these accountability mechanisms should look like, the degree to which the government is consulting well outside its traditional circles. And I just want to stress, again, we're all so eager for a process to happen that can give families a sense of justice, a sense of dignity, and that will be seen as legitimate and credible by the communities affected and by the entire international community. Because everybody's very eager to put this chapter behind the country, but I think it's very important to go through a process that really allows people to know their truth and that ends a culture of impunity that unfortunately had taken a hold here over a period of time. Others, nobody be shy. You can ask about anything.
In what ways do you think the Sri Lankan youth could contribute to the reconciliation process in Sri Lanka?
Thank you. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on all the very specific ways that young people can plug in, but I would just say it's all about you. And in a way, if your generation, which again, most of you have very vivid memories of what it was like to be afraid of terrorism, or the deprivation that went along with war, or you have family members who were displaced, or maybe yourselves, maybe some of your families were personally affected by loss or by disappearances. So if the young people who have gone through that can move past that and build bridges to other communities and view their identities in the broadest possible terms as Sri Lankan citizens, with pride in the incredible diversity of this country. So where diversity is a sense of, hey, I'm Sri Lankan, that means all these things, as distinct from diversity being something that can be polarizing and has been polarizing in the past. That would be amazing. And so I think if students in this country, as I understand it, have a great tradition of being politically active in decades past and viewing the country's future as theirs to shape. And I think if young people now were involved in those ways, I also, I think young people getting into politics and to public service shape the answer to a lot of these questions. And to the degree that you look on the TV and you want to change the channel, when you see, politicians debating with each other, well, that's a sign that you got to go be a politician. If you want to change the channel, you got to go and try. Get in there, see what it's like, make it different if you don't like the politics. And again, I think that the new government really is welcoming of fresh ideas and of the spirit of young people. And certainly they say that everything they're doing is for your generation. And I think that's one reason that the United States is so eager to support them. But getting in the mix, even if it seems a little daunting, I think that would be great. Others?
Ambassador Ishan Jalil, representing Action Against Apathy. My question to you is, it's a statement and a question. So, before the 8th of January this year, if we talk about human rights, as you very well know, any person who talks about human rights would be portrayed as a traitor and a person who basically does some kind of a, basically is a conspirator with the West. Whereas after the 8th, thankfully the situation has changed. So you as a person who has, before being a diplomat, who has worked extensively in the field of human rights, what is your advice to Sri Lankan youth to protect, promote and ensure human rights and to make this a human rights friendly country? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first, let me address your comment because I think it's extremely important. What happened in Sri Lanka happens in countries all around the world. Just sometimes politicians of whatever party, this is a nonpartisan point, want to distract from what's going on, and they can find ways to blame the foreigners, or blame the West, or blame colonialism, or and there's plenty of blame to go around in terms of history, and sometimes even in the present there's plenty of criticism that is legitimate. But I think what is important about the change is the outside world had nothing to do with it. It was the people of Sri Lanka, it was the journalists who saw their colleagues, sometimes killed and disappeared, who kept going out there notwithstanding the fear and writing what they saw. They kept writing editorials about what they believed the principles should be. It was the young people who went out and voted, some for the first time. So this is a wholly Sri Lankan story, what has happened in your country. And even the activities that went on in Geneva that were, again, caricatured as somehow something from the outside, it was Sri Lankan civil society that was looking just for help and for reinforcement. And so they would, any tools in the toolbox, if there had been domestic accountability, if there were truths that were going to be offered to families who are still, literally, I met families yesterday, still every day they watch TV all the time and they read all the newspapers so that they might catch a glimpse of a photograph with a family member. If there had been mechanisms in this country over the last decade to give those families some respite, if there had been mechanisms that were going to fuel reconciliation instead of division to strengthen democracy, there never would have been anything at the United Nations. Civil society here would have operated within those channels. So I think the reason I give you that response to your comment before I answer your question is the answer is just more of the same. Sri Lanka made the moment, right? Sri Lankans made the moment. Sri Lankans brought about 2 consecutive elections that reinforced the importance of democratic accountability. And again, I describe my own journey from being outside the government to being in it. It's not that much fun when you're in government getting criticized. It's not my favorite thing, is to read how I'm selling out my principles, and I have other things I like more than that. But that's the job of people outside, is to tell us where we're not measuring up. This government has made a series of incredibly important commitments. And seeing human rights advanced in this country means holding government accountable to those commitments. And human rights don't come about in the abstract. People have to defend those rights. They have to go to court to make sure that those rights are realized. They have to take risks, gathering and using their freedom of association, using the power of the pen, and calling it like they see it, just like they did through all of those difficult years, notwithstanding the risks. So my main answer is just keep doing what you're doing. It's really captured the imagination of the world.
எனது பெயர் துஷ்யந்தன். நான் இலங்கை தமிழரசு கட்சியை பிரதிநிதித்துவப்படுத்தி வந்திருக்கிறேன்.
I think we translation.
I am Dushyantan. I'm representing Ilangai Tamilarasu Katchi.
இதில் என்னால் ஆங்கிலத்தில் கதைக்க முடியாமைக்கு மன்னிப்பு கேட்டுக்கொள்கின்றேன்.
My apologies for not talking in English.
வடக்கு கிழக்கு பகுதி சம்பந்தமாக அந்த பகுதியின் பிரதிநிதி என்ற அடிப்படையிலே இலங்கையினுடைய நல்லிணக்கம் சம்பந்தமாகவும் கிட்டத்தட்ட 60 வருடங்களுக்கு மேலாக வடக்கு கிழக்கு மக்கள் அனுபவிக்கின்ற துன்பவியல் நிகழ்வுக்கு கூட
As a representative of the North and East, the people from North and East are like suffering from these problems for more than 60 years.
அமெரிக்க அனுசரணையோடு எங்களுக்கு எவ்வாறான தீர்வு இந்த நாட்டிலே கிடைக்கப் போகின்றது? இது எங்களுடைய நாடு. நாங்கள் இலங்கை என்பது எல்லா மக்களுக்கும் பொதுவான நாடு என்பதை நாங்கள் ஏற்றுக்கொள்கின்றோம்.
We accept that this country is ours, Sri Lanka is our country. So what kind of solution will we get sponsored by US?
முக்கியமாக நாங்கள் ஒரு விடயத்தை கொடுப்போம். நாங்கள் பிரிவினைவாதத்தை கோரவில்லை. இங்கிருக்கின்ற எல்லா சகோதரர்களும் உண்மையில் நிறைய இளைய சகோதரர்கள் இருக்கின்றீர்கள். வடக்கிற்கு நீங்கள் எல்லோரும் விஜயம் செய்து நேரடியாக பல முகாம்களை பார்க்க வேண்டியவர்களாக இருக்கின்றீர்கள். என்றால் கண்ணீருடன் வாழ்கின்ற அந்த வாழ்க்கையை நீங்கள் பார்க்கின்ற போது உண்மையிலே நீங்கள் சில விடயங்களை புரிவீர்கள் என்று நம்புகின்றேன்.
We are not calling for separatism. There are so many single brothers, single and other brothers in this hall. So I'm requesting everyone to come and visit, see the camps and see the suffering of our people.
அந்த அடிப்படையிலே யுத்தத்தால் நேரடியாக பாதிக்கின்ற அடிப்படையில் இந்த இனப்பிரச்சனைக்கு தீர்வாக 60 வருடங்களுக்கு மேலாக நீடிக்கின்ற இனப்பிரச்சனை தீர்வாக என்ன தீர்வு திட்டத்தை அமெரிக்கா எங்களுடைய நாட்டினுடைய அரசாங்கத்தோடு சேர்ந்து வழங்க இருக்கின்றது, அது டீசெவலேஷன் என்ற முறையில் அமையும் வேண்டும் என்பதுதான் எங்களுடைய முழுமையான எதிர்பார்ப்பாக இருக்கின்றது. என இதற்குரிய ஒரு விடையை நாங்கள் எதிர்பார்க்கின்றோம். இந்த இனப்பிரச்சனை என்பது மீண்டும் நீண்டு போகக்கூடாது, மீண்டும் ஒரு அழிவு இந்த அழகிய நாட்டிலே வரக்கூடாது என்பது எங்களுடைய விசேஷமாக தமிழ் தேசிய கூட்டமைப்பினுடைய நம்பிக்கையாக இருக்கின்றது. அதன் அடிப்படையில் நாங்கள் இந்த வினாவை உங்களுக்கு விடுக்கின்றேன்.
So we would like to know what kind of solution that US is going to support through Sri Lanka. As a TNA representative, I would like to know that.
Thank you so much, sir, and I'm sorry for speaking in English. Even though I could become a professional LA player, I probably could not do very well in your language. So let me also just even amplify on what I said before. I mean, the part of human rights enjoyment also means ensuring that there are tangible improvements in the social and economic conditions of individuals across this country. And one of the things you said, I think, is extremely important, which is, as it happens, you invited your brothers and sisters to come to the North and East and see the conditions. I think that's kind of what I was getting at in my remarks, which is, can we put ourselves in the shoes of others? Can we imagine what it's like to have had a home, to have lived in that home for generations, and now to have been displaced, and every day to go and try to get that home back, that land back, and just be, not treated with respect or not treated as if you were entitled to that home. So can people who don't live in those circumstances imagine what those circumstances are like? And that's where the more dialogue there is, because it's not just one-sided. Other people again, are living the legacy of what happened over these many decades and the divisions that have torn at this country. So to the extent that there can be more dialogue and more compromise, and I'll say, the United States is looking at the areas that have been most affected, where there are vulnerable people, where there are people that are suffering either extreme poverty or tremendous loss, again, on all sides. And we're looking to invest more and more money and to get other countries to do the same, to try to invest in development, in jobs. And that's going to be extremely important. But if the communities in this country grow and develop apart and don't get to know each other and don't get past what the people in whose interest it is to sow division. There are people who have a vested interest in trying to keep communities from getting to know one another better. There are extremists, just as there are in all countries, on all sides. And it's the job of the very significant majority of the people who live in this country who just want a better life for their kids, who, if they're in your generation, want to have job opportunities, want to be able to travel around the country and not feel fear, want to be able to say what's on their mind. If their leader is corrupt, want to be able to get rid of the leader and hopefully see him held accountable. These are very basic, universal aspirations, and they're shared by all communities. But sometimes one only sees another community from the standpoint of, historical grievance, and if one can see all that one has in common, I think there's a lot of progress that can be made. And it is encouraging. I met, before I came here, with both the president of your country and with the opposition leader, and they are trying very hard to work together, as you know. And there has been land that has been given back, by the military to the people who had lost their homes, again, years ago, but not enough. And in Sri Lanka today, some people see the glass as half full, and some people see it as half empty. I'm not encouraging you to see it one way or the other. When you see it as half empty, it can make you impatient and want to push for more change. When you see it as half full, it can make you optimistic and feel like there's momentum driving. So you can get to being an agent for change no matter how you see the current situation. But if you opt out, and if you think someone else is going to be the one to travel and step into someone else's shoes, and someone else is going to be the one to actually see what a displaced person camp looks like, or what a survivor of terrorism, how that person still lives, and the trauma that those families still live with, and the loss. If you leave that to other people, then it's going to be harder to be part of the change that this country needs. So everyone can take steps to get to know the other.
Ambassador Fab, if you could just take a break from the audience and quickly take a Facebook question, because we have quite a few of those. So Danushka Tilakaratna asks an interesting one. She says, "Dear Honorable Lady, it will be more appreciated if you can reveal the true purpose of your visit to Sri Lanka."
The true purpose. Oh, man. So, I've already kind of confessed my sports ambitions. I am here truly because I find reading the newspaper every day a little bit depressing, because there are a lot of innocent people who are recently, of course, having been killed in terrorist attacks, because leaders, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are trying to keep power when their constitution says explicitly that they shouldn't, that they have had 2 terms and that time is up. But there are a number of leaders trying to change their constitutions, trying to change the judges on the courts so they get a favorable constitutional court ruling. Basically, people putting their own power over the interests of their people, or in the case of terrorism, putting a savage ideology over the welfare of common humanity. And against that dark backdrop, there is Sri Lanka. And I came to Sri Lanka as much for me as I came to try to support you, because it is inspiring what is happening here. And I say that fully aware of all that has not yet been done in terms of reforms and in terms of accountability, in terms of justice for the victims of violence. I get it. There's so much. But I can't think of another country in the entire world where you have seen such change in such a short period of time. I can't. And I'm at the UN, so I should know. I think I would have, if there was some other, story like this one. Burma's pretty exciting, right? We're all very happy about the fact that the military and the Burmese regime recognize the results of these elections. But, in Burma, the Rohingya were completely disenfranchised in advance of that election. And so there's a lot that needs to be done, particularly for the Muslim population in Burma that have seen their rights abridged a lot of late. And here, again, any one of you could give me your list of all the things that, all the promises that haven't yet been fulfilled. But like I said, I cannot think of a country in the world today where there has been this much change in this short a period of time. And I wanted to come and experience it, so I would be skipping to work, happier next week than I would otherwise have been, knowing that this was happening. And also so I could go back and talk to President Obama and share with him ideas about what more the United States can do to try to help you on your journey. So that's the dark conspiracy behind my visit. That's the deep and true meaning.
Thank you for sharing that. So we have time for one more question, so we will go to Anush.
Hi, good afternoon, Ambassador Power. It's a real pleasure to have this interaction with you, and I know you're an inspiration to a lot of women. My wife is secretly quite envious that I got to come and not her. But my question is, I'm sure you've got a lot of questions on Sri Lanka, so my question is about your personal journey.
About what?
Your personal journey and inspiration for leadership. You've had a lot of different eras in your career as a journalist, as an academic, and now in the UN as a diplomat. And those things call for different things, and they motivate you in different ways. Now you can't do some of the things or say some of the things that you would have as an activist or as a journalist, but you get an opportunity to serve in a different way. But it's also frustrating. There are a lot of young people in the room here who are in those different phases. You also call for more young people to get into government. How do you manage sometimes that conflict, the frustration when you see countries, maybe even your own, not being able to do everything that might be right, or individuals who shouldn't be doing what they can be doing? Just your personal journey and inspiration we can draw for leadership and for engagement in public service.
Thank you so much. It's a very nuanced question, and you accurately reflect, I think, the trade-off that one experiences when one moves into government. Interestingly, I think I have more appreciation as a government official about the importance of the checks and balances outside than I did when I was one of the checks and balances. So I don't know. Just to give you an example, on Sri Lanka, the Obama administration had barely taken office, as you know, when the war here was reaching a climactic and very difficult conclusion. And I was the president's advisor for human rights and for multilateral affairs, and of course, you had international organizations that were here. We were hearing from Bob Blake, our ambassador, about harrowing things that were happening. Of course, everybody welcomed the possibility of defeating the LTTE and so forth. But very early on, when I was in office, somebody from an NGO came to see me. I think I'd been in my job. I barely knew where the Situation Room was. And he laid out a map in front of me showing basically this last phase of the war and graphically depicting some of what was happening here. And it was a real moment for me to say, oh, you know, I was reading every day my cables from my ambassador and reading the newspaper, of course, and the intelligence. But it took someone coming in and humanizing it, and it you know, kicked all of us, I think, into the work of this particular non-governmental organization into a wholly different gear. And again, this was only a few days after we had just, we were still looking around saying, we're at the White House, you know, because we'd come from this unlikely political campaign. But then it very quickly, because of the pressure and the facts provided by non-governmental groups, it was, we're at the White House. Now what can we do in order to help people who are very vulnerable in this phase? So that's one thing I would say, is I don't in any way mean to suggest that the path that I've taken is some kind of Darwinian you know, natural selection toward you know, how any particular individual needs to spend their time, because boy, do you appreciate the bravery of civil society, of independent media, the importance of those checks, because you get, when you're in the government, and you know, this is something to bear in mind here as well, you're so busy all the time, and as you are in life, as one is in life as well, but there's a risk that you get in a bubble. And so it's one thing when you're campaigning, you're out, and you're meeting people, and you're hearing their stories, and you're very motivated, but you can get a little removed. And so finding ways to always make sure that you're hearing from these outside voices, that you're not writing off the criticism just because you don't like them. So that's just to validate the checks and balances, the life in any one of those. They are each, as I said earlier, quoting Louis Brandeis and President Obama, you know, the office of citizen, the office of civil society leader, as this country shows, again, probably better than any on earth right now, civil society just never gave up, that it wasn't going to have, it insisted it was going to have democratic and accountable government, and now it has a real chance at strengthening that. In terms of beyond that, I would say in my government life, I'm not that different. I mean, insofar as I have a huge amount of trouble being diplomatic. It's not my strong suit. But also, and I have my team is with me here, a group of people, many of whom come from organizations like Human Rights Watch, or who've been journalists in the past, and you know, come into government to try to create a mix of people who aren't just from one set of experience. I think that diversity, just like interethnic diversity and interfaith diversity, that diversity also makes for more creativity and more problem solving in terms of thinking how to help people. But the motivation for me in all of my careers has been the same. And it's all, wherever I am, I'm just trying to think, what can I do to help? So when I was a journalist, I was thinking, how do I tell that person's story so that someone in government might read that and be moved by that and do something about it? Now I'm the person who has to figure out what to do about it. But I really try, and I encourage anyone who does end up in government, or even in the private sector, to do as this gentleman was suggesting, just to get beyond the abstraction of the problems of our time, to actually meet people who are experiencing them. Because I think that problem solving is really hard, and to have the motivation to cut through the frustration, and when you feel voiceless or like you're not having an impact, the only thing that gets you through, where you just keep stubbornly pressing on, is because you've met the people who are affected, and you feel like there's something sacred in that, and that it's your responsibility, because I'm the lucky one. For all of my work in these different human rights incarnations, or trying to advance the cause of atrocity prevention, or protecting civilians, or promoting human rights, I mean, I have it easy. I was a war correspondent, but I could leave, because it wasn't my home that was being bombed. It wasn't my family that was being attacked. So I've been very blessed, and I feel, you know, that creates a responsibility to try to use whatever job I have to give back as best I can. So thank you.
So I'm sorry, but that's all the questions that we have the time for today. We also have a lot of online questions that we really couldn't get to because of time constraints. Ambassador Power has a busy schedule. So we'd just like to thank you all for your great participation here today. and thank Ambassador Power for
Thank you
her
so much,
invitation.
Tarisha. Thank you. Thank you all.